Welcome to this edition of Under the Radar for Saturday, July 1st, and I think it's time we revisited our old friend, unconscious bias, because it seems the Australian government has had to learn the hard way that it's basically a bunch of bullshit. So if you're new to the concept of unconscious or implicit bias, let me take you back in time to January this year so a much younger me can explain it to you. Now, implicit bias is not new. The idea has been around for about 20 years, and you may have even taken an IAT or implicit association test. And I'll leave a link below if you'd like to try one. Basically, the IAT attempts to pick up biases and beliefs that people are either unaware of or that they know are socially undesirable, so they won't report them. And thus traditional methods like survey instruments or interviews can't pick them up. And the tests don't just examine unconscious attitudes towards different races. Tests have been developed for gender, sexuality, and other categories. And again, you can take a look down below for those types of tests. Now, the problem with unconscious bias is that as an established scientific finding, it has very little empirical support. Firstly, it's not easily replicable, and it seems to be more highly correlated with in-group, out-group preference rather than, say, race. And secondly, the link between unconscious bias as shown on the IAT test and actual behaviour is extremely weak. And if you want a more thorough excavation of the literature on unconscious bias, check out Tilde's video from last year on the same topic. I'll just quickly play one portion of it.
Given the importance of the link between IAT scores and behaviour, one might expect to find a large body of data establishing this connection. Indeed, Greenwald and Krieger describe the evidence that implicit bias leads to discriminatory behaviour as already substantial. In fact, only a handful of studies have examined the ability of IAT to predict behaviour of any type, and just over a dozen published studies have examined the ability of race IAT to predict outcomes that might be indicative of inappropriate or discriminatory behaviours. Yet, the perception exists that the research between IAT scores and behaviour have been much studied and well established. In this report, we closely scrutinise claims that the race IAT predicts discriminatory behaviour and discover that the evidence is surprisingly weak.
Okay, so although the evidence for unconscious bias is tenuous at best, apparently we still need to rid ourselves and our institutions of this insidious scourge. So to do that, we need unconscious bias training, and that's what a lot of large companies have been wasting money on doing. The only problem is, it doesn't really work. Here's that young fella from January again. Two recent studies on implicit bias and microaggressions find opposite results of what SJWs predict.
Surprise, surprise, surprise!
Yeah, what a surprise. In a meta-analysis of change in implicit bias study that was conducted in May 2016 and recently covered by media outlets, researchers amalgamated evidence from 426 studies comprising over 72,000 participants to examine the effectiveness of different interventions for changing implicit bias. So here we're talking about implicit bias training to rid you of those thoughts and beliefs that you don't know you have. And the results from the abstract itself, finally, we found little evidence that changes in implicit bias mediate changes in explicit bias or behaviour. Together, these findings suggest that implicit bias is malleable, but that changing implicit bias does not necessarily lead to changes in explicit bias or behaviour. So whilst implicit bias could be changed, that is, participants would score differently on an implicit association test after an intervention, it doesn't change behaviour, which I think most people would agree is more important. In fact, in one study, it was found that the training can have negative effects, validating individuals' biases and thereby perpetuating them. Quote, "The deleterious effects of stereotyping on individual and group outcomes have prompted a search for solutions. One approach has been to increase awareness of the prevalence of stereotyping in the hope of motivating individuals to resist natural inclinations. However, it could be that this strategy creates a norm for stereotyping, which paradoxically undermines desired effects. The present research demonstrates that individuals who received a high prevalence of stereotyping message expressed more stereotypes than those who received a low prevalence of stereotyping message or no message. So putting stereotypes in people's heads that didn't pay much attention to them to begin with leads them to pay more attention to them. So unconscious bias is a dubious concept, and the training to remedy this evil doesn't really work. But that hasn't stopped the Australian government from charging ahead with unconscious bias training to tackle that non-problem of gender equality. Well, what on earth went wrong? Blind recruitment trial to boost gender equality, making things worse, study reveals. Now wait a minute, I remember a headline about this a few months ago. Unconscious bias is keeping women out of senior roles. Can we get around it? And what was one of those suggestions to get around it? De-identifying CVs or removing all demographic information in applicants' resumes or other forms of submissions. And that's exactly what they did. So obviously the intention of removing demographic information from CVs is so those in the position of hiring would have no way of knowing the gender of the applicant, and thus their bias in favour of men would be overcome and more women would be hired. But unfortunately for the gender ideologues, reality asserted itself and it had the exact opposite effect. And the Australian government has dutifully produced a glossy 22-page document to tell us exactly how badly they got this wrong. Going blind to see more clearly unconscious bias in Australian public service shortlisting processes. Now remember, this is aimed at those privileged white males and their unconscious bias for hiring more of their own kind.
You're fucking a white male!
But what actually happened? Well, it turns out that when gender is known, females are more likely to be shortlisted than males. That's right, instead of having an unconscious bias in favour of men, there was one in favour of women. Not only that, minorities and Indigenous candidates were more likely to be shortlisted when their minority and Indigenous status was identified, and females across all categories were more likely to be shortlisted. So in other words, the entire premise of the need for unconscious bias training, that men are given preference in hiring decisions, was completely wrong. Every category, whether minority female or Indigenous, got preference in front of the white male.
So, you're a white man!
And not only that, you know the worst offenders, those older white males? Well, they were 10% more likely to favour female minorities. So the idea of introducing de-identified CVs to reduce bias against women would actually result in less women being shortlisted because there's already a bias in favour of women. And we shouldn't be totally surprised by this. Remember the well-publicised finding from Cornell University that showed women were preferred 2-to-1 over men for STEM faculty positions. So wait a minute, there's an unconscious bias against men in the public service? Yeah, but that's never mentioned in the report because that's not a problem. It's only a problem if there's a bias against women. Because you see, as they point out at the beginning of the report, women are almost 50% of the workforce but are underrepresented in management and executive level positions. In 2016, women comprised 59% of the Australian public service as a whole, but accounted for only 48.9% of its executive level officers and only 43% of its senior executive service officers. But hang on, if women are almost 50% of the workforce, and according to the ABS they are 46.5% of the workforce as of May 2017, then shouldn't we be trying to reduce the number of women in the public service, since they make up 59% of the Australian public service? I mean, if we're going to use this grade school logic that men and women should be equally represented across the workforce and at all levels. But why would women be underrepresented in management in comparison to the overall workforce? It must be unconscious bias, right? Although clearly we've already established that there's no problem in hiring women. So what could it be? Well, about 2 minutes of looking through the ABS stats might give you a clue, because you see, despite being 46.5% of the overall workforce, women only represent 36% of the full-time workforce, which of course is due to sexism and nothing to do with individual women opting for greater work-life balance than men, as every study on the subject shows. Now we'll just ignore that and press on with our ideological crusade. Now, after all, as the report concludes, However, it remains clear that more work needs to be done to address the problem of gender inequality. The shortlisting stage of recruitment is just one small piece of the diversity puzzle. Other stages of recruitment could be tested, including how positions are advertised, what information is requested from applicants, how interviews are conducted, and how hiring panels are selected and run. We also need to study factors that influence career trajectories once candidates are hired, including opportunities for training and professional development, talent management, performance reviews, evaluations for promotion, and flexible working arrangements. Ah yes, the good old flexible working arrangements. So women can still be executives without putting in those pesky hours usually required of executives. So if you're an Australian white male looking for a career in the Australian public service, just remember the odds are already stacked against you given the unconscious bias in favour of women when it comes to hiring. And it looks like the ideologues are busy looking for more ways to make sure you don't get ahead. So if you're a white Australian male, the only logical choice is to avoid working for the government. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.